UNLV Microcertificate Economics. Central banks. A central bank is the government-controlled, owned, operated bank in a country. It's the bank that's somehow tied to the government of that country. In the United States of America, we have the Federal Reserve System. Many years ago, we had something called Bank of the United States, but that was killed. And for a long time, we didn't have a central bank, and now we have the Federal Reserve. What do central banks do? Well, there's 5 basic functions. The first is that the central banks clear checks and electronic payments. The Federal Reserve clears more checks and electronic payments than any other entity in the country. If you use your debit card and the company that you used it at, you swiped your debit card at Chipotle and they use one bank and you use a different bank, how does that money get between banks? The Federal Reserve moves it and charges people for moving it, like a business. Number 2, anything you do at your bank, bank can do at the Fed, so the Fed makes loans to banks, the Fed has deposits of banks, does banking stuff. 3, the rules and regulations like the 12% rule we talked about, the reserve requirement, non-discrimination in lending rules, how much the bank can lend out to the stock market, various things like that. Rules and regulations for banks are set by the central bank. Number 4, the central bank controls the money supply and interest rates. And number 5, the central bank is the lender of last resort. That means that when the economy goes bad, it's up to the central bank to make sure that money's in the system so people can make transactions, and that people who qualify for loans can find someone to loan to them. Okay. Beyond that, the Fed may help other agencies and central banks do their jobs, so they would tell you that they have a much more complex work environment. The idea of independence is very important. Most economists think that central banks need to operate independently from politics. The reason is that governments, and we've talked about this before, governments don't mind inflation, they hate unemployment. Economists don't mind unemployment unless it's on themselves, and they hate inflation. So if you want a central bank to worry about inflation, they have to be independent of politics. Countries with independent central banks have lower inflation rates than countries that don't. So the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913 after a big financial panic in 1907 that essentially J.P. Morgan saved the country, and people didn't think that was necessarily a great idea, that some private citizen saved America. But because Andrew Jackson did not like central banks, the Federal Reserve was actually sold to the American public as a system to manage reserves. That's why it's called the Federal Reserve System. It's a way to manage reserves across the United States. So banks that have too much reserves or don't have enough can move their reserves around. There's a lot of other central banks in the world, and I gave you just a few names here so you understand that when you talk about some of these banks, they're central banks: Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Bank of Korea, People's Bank of China, Reserve Bank of Australia. The European Central Bank and the Central Bank of West African States are interesting because those are where countries share currency. So the euro is used all across Europe, and the African franc is used all across West Africa. They have one central bank that spans a number of countries, but then some of those countries still have their own central bank. So Germany has the Bundesbank. Sweden has the Sveriges Riksbank. There's these central banks that are still operating in Europe, even though they have a central bank, which is for all of Europe. Federal Reserve is run by a board of governors. 7 people theoretically appointed for 14-year terms, but they hardly ever stay that long. There should still be, this year, we should have had 1 Bush appointee roll off, the last one, and Biden should have appointed his first, and there should be 4 Obamas on there and 2 Trumps on there. Unfortunately, two things happen. One is that people don't stay their whole 14 years. You can make a whole lot more money out in the private sector. And Congress has stopped trying to govern the country and instead just spends their time trying to block the other people from doing stuff. So the last 2 years Obama was president, the Republicans in the Senate would not approve any of his appointees to the Federal Reserve Board. And then Trump didn't name a lot of people and didn't even really try to fill all the spots. And at one point when Donald Trump was president, there were only 2 members of the Federal Reserve Board. He fired Janet Yellen, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve Board. She was the first woman chair. He did replace her with Jerome Powell, who was an Obama appointee, and Powell just got reappointed by Biden. So he's going to be chair for another 4 years. The chair is only chair for 4 years. It's an interesting situation in that we expect this Board of Governors to be running the financial system, working with all the complicated things that's going on. You need lots of people in lots of different roles, and we don't have those people, and we haven't had those people. There's 4 people on right now. So it's a problem, continues to be a problem, and you wish the Senate would go back to approving people. Federal Reserve system is an actual system. There are 12 banks, plus branches actually, so there are way more than 12 banks, spread across the entire United States. And in this picture, you can see how the country is split up. Each district is supposed to be a unique economy. So, for example, all of the steel mills in the United States basically were in 4 when 4 was founded. All the automobile production was in 7. You look at 10, and it's farmers and ranchers, some mining. The only district that doesn't make sense is 12. 12 has, Nevada and California and Idaho and Alaska and Hawaii and Samoa, and 12 has a little bit of everything. It's a fun district. We live out here in 12. It's the fun district. But you can see the country divided up into these 12 districts. And no District 13. No Katniss Everdeen. So each district has a president, and it has a 9-person board of directors. So you've got these 7 people in Washington, and then you have essentially 10 people per district that run that district, and there's 12 districts. That's 127 people right there. There's lots and lots of people involved in this. The board of directors of a district includes 3 bankers who are elected by the bankers in their district, 3 business people, and 3 members of the non-banking public. And the chair of that board has to be one of the non-banking public people. Within the Federal Reserve by law, there is also something called the Federal Open Market Committee. When the Fed was first set up, it really wasn't independent. The Secretary of the Treasury ran it. There was other stuff. And so Congress figured out that wasn't a good idea, split everything off, and put onto it, within the Fed structure, this Federal Open Market Committee. The Federal Open Market Committee is the entity in the Fed responsible for controlling the money supply and interest rates. It is the 7 members of the Board of Governors, plus, on a rotating basis, 5 of the bank presidents. New York always serves because New York is, where bonds are. But the other 11 districts besides New York, they rotate on and off 4 at a time onto this Federal Open Market Committee. So there's a diversity of opinion. The whole country gets represented. Democracy. How does the Open Market Committee do its job? Well, that phrase, Open Market Committee, should tell you something. The Federal Open Market Committee does its job by buying and selling bonds. Let's think for a second. You have a bond that you bought from the government. I, the Federal Reserve, want to increase the money supply. I go in the back room, I print up some brand new money that's never been used. I go to you, and I get you to give me your bond. I buy the bond from you. The Federal Reserve buys your bond. When it does that, it gives you this fresh money, and now we've increased the money supply. If instead you're sitting home with a bunch of money, and I want to lower the money supply, the Federal Reserve comes to me, says, hey, I got this bond. It's got a really nice interest rate. It's really cheap. I sell you this bond. I take your money away. I go shred it. and now I've lowered the money supply. So the Federal Reserve controls the money supply by buying and selling bonds, open market operations. So as the Fed changes the money supply and does a few other things, that's going to affect interest rates, right? As money becomes more scarce, its price, the interest rate will go up. If it becomes less scarce, its interest rate will go down. Yes, this is exciting. It's exciting. There's two interest rates that the Fed really looks at. One of those is called the discount rate. That's the internal rate it sets at which banks can borrow from the Fed. So if I'm a bank and I need money, I can come borrow from the Fed. I don't do that. The discount rate is usually symbolic. It's always the lowest rate in the economy, but really people, unless there's a disaster like 2009, people do not go borrow from the Fed. It's just, banks do borrow from each other. And there's a thing called the federal funds rate, which is the rate at which one bank can borrow from another bank. And they just borrow overnight. They borrow long enough to make sure their books all balance and make sure that everything's good. Usually they don't borrow for long term. The Federal Reserve controls this interest rate, and it does it again in this whole ample reserve architecture. For years now, they've kept it really low, and we'll talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. When they were starting to raise it, President Trump got all mad at them because that'll slow the economy down, right? Higher interest rates will slow the economy down. And he jawboned them, yelled at them until they made the Fed funds rate go back down, basically. They stopped raising it. But now that there's inflation in the economy, they're raising and going to slowly raise the Fed funds rate to help get rid of that inflation. And really, you need to take Econ 103 so you can learn all the fun stuff about the Fed.